Okay, I won't address directly the papers. I'm reacting to what you said this morning. I think I'm very happy. They were really important contributions. I think the first thing that came to my mind is when we talk about this privatization wave, what is the timing we're looking at? So it's not an event that happened in 1992, as in the case of Italy, it's a process. When did that process start? When did that process end? Since many of you, and Laurent in particular, have pointed out that until the 1970s, this was actually an era of nationalizations. And even surprisingly, Britain created a national oil company called British National Oil Company in 1975, and there were debates on control of foreign multinationals and so on and so forth until the very early 1980s. And then from the paper of Massimiliano, we and Saverio, we learned that for the Middle East and North Africa region, we're actually talking about the end of the 1990s and the years 2000. So it's a long process, which in a way, to my mind, actually confirms that it defines an era that is this era we're talking about as the neoliberal era. But then we have to ask ourselves, why did one country come first and the other country come second? Why is Thatcher at that privatized telecoms that particular year, and why did Italy? So that's why it's interesting to go in the specific cases. The second point that came to my mind is the meaning. What is the meaning of privatizations? And I think most of you, and I guess we all agree, that is not about the disappearance of the state. So what is it about? So here many people refer to neo-statism. That could be an option. Others refer to the neoliberal state. But I think what Melanie Veh, her contribution is important for us because it explains us that while we could speak of a new state, a neoliberal state, a neo-statism, what really defines a problem of that era is the disappearance of the public economy. The public economy is something, it's a broader concept than state participation in enterprises. And it is the public economy that suffered. It's not the role of the state in the companies. And the state remained in the companies, but I would say it's the software that operated these companies, these public utilities, the new welfare state that changed. And the problem is that as historians, we don't have the intellectual tools, all of them, to understand, how the public economy changed in the 1990s, and that's why we need the jurists, the sociologists, the philosophers. We need all of them because that's their contribution to our understanding of what it means, the weakening of the public economy, including in Europe in the 1990s. The second, third issue is, what's the specific lesson we can derive from privatization in Europe and in Italy in particular? I think Laurent points out, but most of the other contributions points out that most of the decisions were taken locally, by national politicians, or maybe at a EU level, or in the interaction between the EU level and local politicians. Now we could give it for granted that that is normal, but I guess if you ask in Chile or in the 1970s or maybe in Mexico in the early 1980s, that's not necessarily the case. So that is a peculiarity of the European Union, which in a way also leads us to address, is there a EU model? And here I think it would be important to reason, is there a EU model towards a neoliberal state that is different from United States, which, you can speak of a deregulated state, or China, where you can speak of political capitalism or define it as you want. So we are in this, we're questioning what is a European model of the privatized state or of neo-statism. And also here, Melanie Weil, I think, brings us a value added. Were there alternatives? I think we have, as historians, to dig into the questions of what the alternatives were. And as we learned from Melanie Weil, there was a big pushback against competition policy and privatizations during the 1990s. There was a strong struggle at the governmental level. Some companies, Centre Européen des Entreprises Publiques. So we give it for granted that they lost that battle for the public economy, but we have to understand what their point was, what they were arguing. What political families, and here we go to the Socialist International, what were the most important EU political families in framing the concept, in a way, of the new EU privatized state or the neoliberal state? You could argue in many ways that with intended or unintended consequences, possibly the socialists had a key role in this framing of the new neoliberal state. Could this be because they were more open to some form of international cooperation? And in essence, it should be an internationalist project, so it could translate its interest from the global level to the EU level. But this leads us to something that is addressed in the paper of Massimiliano Trentin, which I'm really interested about, is, so if there is a European EU project for a, you could define it as a neoliberal state or neo-statist, EU neo-statism, does it have an external dimension? How strongly has the EU acted as a foreign policy actor to, in a way, promote its own model in other areas of the world? We have learned from Massimiliano and Saverio that it was not very successful, apparently, in some parts of the Middle East and North Africa. You could argue that it made a big effort, for example, with the European Energy Charter, to promote its own legal framework to the Soviet Union and its and the countries that were part of the Soviet Union. Was it successful? Obviously, if you look at what's happening now, you could argue even there it was not very successful. The last point I want to make, and maybe this addresses more to the paper on British Telecom, is, so what are the actors of privatizations we should be looking at? We look at the EU competition commissioners, which were absolute protagonists in a way of that era. They were on the newspapers. People knew their names. Obviously, I don't think before the 1990s anybody knew the name of a competition commissioner, while most of the people probably still didn't know them in the 1990s, but at least they were on the press. And so they are important, the technocrats are important, the politicians are important. But I think here we come to the fact that since this is the age of financialization, we cannot write really the history of what was happening without getting into the into the mechanisms of finance, which actually means looking at the archives of banks. Financializations means the increasing role of financial actors in the economy, and protagonists of financializations are also banks, So if we don't get into what their agenda was, what their policies were, who they were talking to, how they were talking to these people. For example, in the documents I read from Bernabé, half of the documents are from Goldman Sachs, financial advisors of various kinds. So what was their agenda? In the case of British Telecom, we learned it because you were, you pointed it out pretty clearly. What was their agenda in other sectors? And here I'm stopping because right now too long. Thank you.